So this is my first trip back to Disneyland since the Haunted Mansion reopened in its normal mode. It was the holiday overlay for an entire season, and then they closed for most of the summer to do a remodel. They never switched it back, so when they reopened it after the remodel, it was still Haunted Mansion Holiday. It went through another entire holiday season that way, and now, finally, it's back to normal, so I can't wait to ride it. There's another reason I can't wait to ride it, and that's because there is a new bride scene that everyone's talking about. It was revealed a few weeks ago, I think, so finally I get to see it myself. And so I didn't know what lens would be best to bring to photograph it, so I just brought them all. I'm going to ride Haunted Mansion a half a dozen times today at least, and I'm going to try to shoot it with every single lens, specifically focusing on the new bride scene. I'm not going to go through how to shoot every scene with every lens, but this will give you an idea of what focal lengths work and which ones might not work if you are planning a trip to photograph the Haunted Mansion. It's 8 o'clock, it's right after rope drop. It's Super Bowl Sunday, so nobody is here yet. The ride, it looks like it's currently a walk-on, so let's get started.
I'm going to start with the Olympus 8mm f1.8 fisheye Pro because I think it makes the most sense to start wide and slowly zoom in and in and in until we find something that can no longer keep the whole subject in the frame. So this fisheye is great for shots like this in the stretching room. You want to get the entire space from edge to edge in your frame. This is one of the few lenses that will allow you to do that. It can make small spaces seem very large. The downside starts to come in on the edges. Shots like this, you can really see the distortion. Another downside to the fisheye lens can be seen in large spaces like this one in the seance room, where the subject in the middle can actually be very, very small and lost in a sea of background. Another property of the fisheye lens is it can also pull objects in the foreground even closer. So in this example, the fence in the front of the frame seems very prominent, and in video I can see through it, and in video you can get the point, but for a still you're going to find it way too distracting. And now as we enter the attic scene, we're going to make our way towards the new attraction that we came here to photograph. Here she is. Here is the new bride animatronic. I think it looks fantastic, but when you shoot it with a fisheye lens, again, the subject is far enough away where it kind of feels lost at the very back of the frame, and you see a lot of the foreground surrounding it. This feature can be used to your advantage, like in this shot where I used the wideness of this lens to incorporate more of the attic scene, but I feel that that comes at the expense of being able to see all of the detail in this new animatronic. So let's try this again with a slightly less wide lens. This is now a 12mm f2 lens, and this is a rectilinear lens. It's not a fisheye lens. You can see that here in the seance room. You don't see as much black around the subject. Here in the ballroom, you don't have the full top to bottom view, but if you stay above the fence, you can punch in and see a little bit more detail. The fence is still distracting, but I feel that it doesn't curve towards you the way it did in the fisheye lenses. And here with the bride, we can have a little less distortion, and we can zoom in a little bit closer to start to see a little bit more of that detail, but still giving a nice environmental portrait where you can see just enough background to give it context. Next up is my favorite lens, the 17mm f1.2 Pro. It gives me, I think, the perfect field of view for a lot of rides. In this example, you can see the stretching portrait all the way from top to bottom. You still get a nice view of the ceiling when it goes transparent. In full frame terms, this would be a 34mm equivalent focal length, and I think just that focal length is a great all-round perspective. Like in this shot of the hallway, it's absolutely perfect. It's not too wide, it's not too long. You see everything you want to see with no cropping. Same here in the seance room. You can now see the spell book in the front of the frame. You can still see the detail in the Madame Leota head. For more distant subjects like the ballroom, that fence in the foreground is still pretty distracting, but you can see through it. In video, it's going to still be very distracting in still images, and so for this particular scene, I think I would still recommend a longer focal length, but it does fine for video. This one was kind of fun because part of the projection was off, so you can see what the bride looks like when the main projection is off. There is still a lot of practical effect here. I metered this scene two different ways. This first one, I used spot metering, which brings out a lot of detail in the bride herself, but it kind of mutes the background. And here, overall metering brought in a lot more background, but it washed out some of the bride's detail, and it ended up being a much higher ISO. So I generally recommend using spot metering for this subject. Next up is the 25mm f1.2 Pro. This gives a 50mm equivalent in 35mm terms. So we're getting a little tighter here in the stretching room. You can barely see one of the stretching portraits from top all the way to the bottom. You do get a nice view of the hanging guy once the ceiling goes transparent. So we're slowly punching in and seeing more and more detail. Like here in the seance room, you can really get some good detail on Madame Leota's face and on the spell book. So for some scenes, this lens is really, really good. And this bride scene is one of them. You can see it almost perfectly fills the entire frame. But once we start zooming in tighter than this, we will no longer be able to keep the whole subject in frame, and we're going to have to start focusing on an individual part of the subject. I also shot this one in overall metering mode, so if you want to lower your ISO and get more detail in the bride's dress, I recommend switching to spot metering. This next lens is one that I haven't been using a whole lot recently, but I am starting to fall back in love with the 45mm focal length. This 45mm f1.8 lens from Olympus gives me a 90mm field of view in 35mm terms. It starts to get a little more challenging to use because you can see how much farther in we are zooming on our subject. You're going to find with a lens this tight that not every subject is going to be able to be photographed, and you're going to have to pick and choose your targets. But when you do find subjects that work, like this shot of Madame Leota, this is a great focal length for certain subjects. In the case of the bride, I can now no longer have the entire subject from the peak of the roof down to the bottom of her dress in frame, so I used spot metering and focused on the center of her body to get that shot. Next up is the 75mm f1.8 lens. I love this lens for the results that it can give, but at a 150mm equivalent focal length, it is a very challenging lens to use. As you can see, this lens will magnify anything that you are doing wrong if you're not able to hold the camera steady, especially when you're shooting in low light and you have to use a long shutter speed. You're going to see it in your images, but when you can pull it off, look at the detail you can get. You can fill the frame with your subject, and you can isolate it from the background due to its shallow depth of field. And unfortunately, that can kind of bite you on a subject like the bride. In these images, I chose to focus on the candelabra because it is a physical object and not a projection, and so I knew I could focus on that, and the camera would track focus on the candelabra. But because the candelabra is closer to the frame than her face, it makes it seem like her face is soft. It's also soft because it's a projection and it's supposed to be a ghost. So for that reason, I wouldn't recommend this focal length for this subject for most people. It's just too challenging. You're going to have a lot more fun with a shorter lens. And this last one I did just to be silly. I had a 150mm f2 lens that I was bringing to the park for the first time on this trip, and I was already doing this test of all my other primes, and I said, let's see what a 150mm f2 is going to do in the Haunted Mansion. Again, that's a 300mm equivalent field of view, and as you can see, it can punch in really, really tight, but that much magnification makes it really difficult even for an image stabilized body like the OM1 Mark II has. You can see how jittery and jumpy it is and how hard it is. And when it comes to the bride, this is the only shot I was able to get with that lens, and it's acceptable considering how hard it is to shoot with a lens this large and heavy and difficult to stabilize. I wouldn't recommend bringing a lens this long on Haunted Mansion unless you're just trying to have a goof like I am. So here once again are all 7 images side by side so you can see the relative coverage of every lens from 8mm all the way to 150mm. Again, these are all on a micro 4/3 system, so if you're using 35mm, multiply that focal length by 2 to figure out which lens you need to use to give you a rough equivalent. I think the best one to use is going to be the 17 and the 25. They're just about perfect for filling the frame, and they give lots of detail because of those fast apertures. Well, thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it informative. I hope you found it entertaining. I hope I gave you some ideas for things you might try for your next trip through the Haunted Mansion when it comes to equipment selection and focal length selection. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.